Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Dan Borscher, coming to you from the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Coming up, Australian kids' writing skills in serious decline according to the latest national review. What matters more, a sporting club's values or securing sponsorship? We'll look at what's happening within Netball Australia. And First Nations elder Uncle Jack Charles is laid to rest at a state funeral service in Melbourne. Joining me on the panel, industry professor at the Jumbunna Institute of Education and Research at UTS and Labor Party member Nareen Young, who I know very well from the not-for-profit board that we sit on. Welcome.
Oh, I'm so glad to be here with you, brother.
Great to have you along. CEO of Just Reinvest and former Liberal Party candidate Geoffrey. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Dan. Less glowing welcome, but anyway.
What a stitch up. In Brisbane, senior research fellow at Deakin University, John Davis. Good to have you here as well.
Oh, Biggie, thanks for having us.
And senior lecturer in medical education and Indigenous health at the University of Melbourne, Dr. Ngaree. Great to see you again too.
Great to see you too, Dan.
What a deadly panel, and you can join us on Twitter using the hashtag The Drum. We're on Facebook as well. Well, most of Australia's Year 9 students use punctuation the same way as a child in 3rd grade. That's one of several alarming findings from a national review of writing standards for students in years 3 to 9. The report released today shows students' skill levels declined in all areas of writing apart from spelling between 2011 and 2018. The review recommends equipping teachers with more resources, support and training to bring struggling students back up to speed. The Drum's David Taylor has more.
The results of a national review of school students' writing standards are alarming. The Australian Education Research Organisation reviewed 10 million NAPLAN writing results for students in years 3 to 9 from 2011 to 2018. It focused on the results from persuasive writing tasks. The report points to a serious decline in writing skills for many students, but particularly for those in high school.
Clearly they have multiple significant gaps in their knowledge about language use, how to use punctuation, how to use grammar, how to structure sentences, how to communicate their intended meaning.
It revealed 85% of Year 9 students are at least 2 years behind in their ability to structure sentences. The review also showed the majority of Year 9 students are using punctuation at a 3rd class level. For example, students in Year 9 should be able to use complex punctuation like colons, semicolons and dashes to clarify meaning. Compare that to a child in 3rd class who is only expected to use capital letters to start a sentence and a full stop or a question mark at the end.
We've talked about our introduction, we've talked about that we want to be using our best spelling.
The fear is that students who are not keeping pace with set standards will fall behind their peers and stay behind.
So I'm going to say it's a massive challenge for students who find themselves in Year 9 and not having the basic competence in written language.
The report makes clear this isn't just about raising literacy skills so students meet set standards. It's about equipping children for life, from making a persuasive case to have a rental bond returned, for example, or writing that great job application. So, what can be done? The report suggests providing teachers with more support to, you guessed it, teach writing. The authors suggest part of the problem may be there's been too much focus on teaching reading skills at the expense of writing.
So it's now time for writing to have its priority attention.
John, you work squarely in education. Did this report surprise you?
Not surprised in the fact that there's been a real focus over the last decade and a half around drill and skilling, especially around NAPLAN frame. So there's been a real pressure for our teaching teams all around the country to make sure that students are performing to the set standards and the set teaching tests that are part of that NAPLAN stream.
Did it give us a sense of educational outcomes for Indigenous children as well?
So we talk about this often about the notion of the gap, and I know we don't frame things around gaps. There's a structural and institutional racist pivot, and that's around education is designed against us. That's why something like as challenging as truth-telling isn't at the forefront of the Australian curriculum. It's considered a cross-curricular priority when it comes to our national curriculum. So it's no shock factor that Indigenous education outcomes, when it comes to a lot of the standardised testing, is at a gap level. The difference there, though, is the comparison of international data, say, for example, PISA data, where our Indigenous students score quite highly when it comes to environmental science and their interest and intrigue around science. So there's a real challenge for us as a nation around how we create energy and excitement around curriculum.
Ngaree, is there a correlation here to broader health and mental health as well?
Well, I think in terms of healthcare, when I think about teaching, so when I'm teaching medical students, we've really moved with the times a bit. So we've been changing the way we teach and using more media, social media, other ways to, I guess, embrace how society also frames how we learn. And when it comes to mental health, you know, a lot of the strength, particularly from our communities, comes from storytelling, which is an oral tradition, not necessarily written, although a lot of that is now being turned into books through audiobooks. And I think we can be more inventive and creative around health and well-being, and we can actually use culture as a strength to improve, I guess, the way that we teach and how we teach.
Nareen, if we've already got students that are falling behind in primary school, what does that mean for the next steps of their education as they go into high school?
Well, clearly literacy is a life skill, and as John has outlined, and he knows a lot about what he's talking about, it's obviously a really big problem for First Nations kids. I'd like to step back. I'm a bit cynical about research around literacy and writing here. Seems to me that about every 5 years some research comes out, is released, that may or may not be ideologically skewed around certain ways of thinking around literacy and numeracy. Our kids often wear labels, as John can talk about much more than I can, around behaviour and around accessing literacy and numeracy in classrooms that isn't valid and is of concern. So I'd be wanting to know more about the research before I accepted that it's not a problem, whether it's a problem or not, because if I see, for example, Kevin Donnelly come out tomorrow and talk about how it's a scandal and we're not teaching kids properly and it become part of the culture wars again, then I will be even more cynical about that research.
Well, Geoffrey, you clearly want to weigh in on
no,
that.
it's interesting because I had a similar question when I saw the data and the research. It's produced by a body that was an Australian national standards entity stood up as a result of the Gonski 2.0 reform, which I thought was quite interesting because we come on shows like this and talk about major developments in public policy, but it's very rare. I mean, this data I think was 2011 to 2018. We're now seeing it today.
I think it was 2013 to 18.
And now we're seeing a piece of research produced by a body that was stood up by a major transformative piece of education. I don't disagree with Nareen at all. What would be interesting to understand is how they expect this to move moving forward. I mean, what are the consequences? It's one thing to say the metrics that were stood up some time ago aren't delivering results today. What's the consequence of that? Is there, I mean, you're an industry professor and employment's a particular focus of yours, and the piece earlier spoke about this. How do we expect this to flow into employment prospects, or in the work we do, how are children, young people, particularly Aboriginal people, who unfortunately I suspect are overrepresented in this group, and who would also then flow into other points of contact with government where writing is important. How is their response to court documents going to produce bail outcomes, going to produce incarceration outcomes? That would be interesting to understand.
So does this give you any clarity or clarification on that, or is that actually a separate body of work that should happen?
Around First Nations kids?
Yeah, and
absolutely.
that broader flow-on point there.
And again, I defer to John, and I know there's a lot of work has been done and will continue to be done. But, for example, I've done some work recently surveying Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander teachers, and there's around employment issues and of course the issue of workplace racism. And I did some work when I was at PwC's Indigenous Consulting as well for the New South Wales Department of Education, and the racism that still exists in schools towards teachers, I would imagine, would have to be replicated towards children. My kids went to a primary school that was a priority Aboriginal school, so they didn't have a normal experience, I don't think. But, you know, I've heard stories about parents who, as soon as their child is put into a class of an Aboriginal teacher on the first day of school, march up to the school and ask them for the child to be removed. So if that's what's happening to teachers, what must be still happening to kids?
What will be interesting is we saw this week in New South Wales major reforms introduced around Aboriginal languages being taught in the public curriculum. Also, I should note, John used curricula and curriculum perfectly during his explanation. So let's be honest, the First Nations people on this panel seem to not fall into this stats, and there's going to be kids who don't fall into that stat. And what is the focus about telling stories of the strengths basis of kids coming through this? But I just wonder how will the interplay occur when we've got First Nations languages, which, by the way, probably don't conform and won't support learning outcomes in traditional English grammar and sentence structure, play out in the long run. John probably has a view on that.
I just mentioned before, the national curriculum is a cross-curriculum priority, our Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander education component. To have First Nations up front, languages, means our communities, our young people, and the data supports it too, can base themselves within their stream, within their locality, and then aim for that higher order learning process, which has already been affirmed around learning another language. So when you're revitalising a language, or you're reinforcing your language, if you're blessed to be in those kind of Far North Queensland, Torres Strait type environments, then it can actually it has that flow-on effect of creating a really powerful curriculum pathway. I'd like to sing out too. I know Sister Fee Kelly, principal at Menindee Central, that's amazing work with the Barkinji over many years with the communities there, building community program, then leading into an ATAR, a real clear languages pathway for the students to go through from primary through all the way through to high school and then into university. And these parts are the ways that we can invert the gap, and that's why that's the potentiality that exists. I think a pointing point just to flag too was that the Year 9 data that was flagged was for all students. So there's a real challenge when it comes to looking at the structures of our curriculum pedagogy. And thanks for picking up my late code switch there, appreciate that. But there's a real challenge in making sure that we provide, or we give the tools for teachers to have the space to be creative, to be innovative. Because when it comes to other models that outperform us in OECD nations, like the Scandinavian countries, they don't have the same prescriptive, restrictive processes that we have prescribed. And in reality, in Australia, we base this off the NAPLAN testing, or No Child Left Behind, which was a failed American model, and often our education diaspora gets challenged by mob from legal fraternities or economic fraternities. We really need to get back to our base roots about the equity that education can bring, and then how we can do that. The curriculum crunches are really important. The time factor. I noticed the Federal Minister of Education spoke about this morning on ABC about the pressures teachers are feeling. So this is like a front end and back end conversation, because there's a real pressure teachers feel in the field about being able to respond to these challenges. And I agree with Sis there on the panel. It's always important to have a critical eye on where these particular pieces come and pivot from.
Well, I think so, John. And that example you just gave then about NAPLAN, my kids are the NAPLAN generation, and it seems to me that I'm not opposed to it, but it was the result of ideological media fervour about basic skills. Can I also point out that my kids were lucky enough, very fortunate, to be among the first kids to be the recipients of the language work that Uncle Stan Grant has done. They learnt Wiradjuri. They're 27 and 21. Now, no one in our family had spoken language for numerous generations. Cheryl Riley was their teacher, and for both of them, this is pretty wacky and weird. Their teachers, I can't remember who my oldest ones was, but Cheryl pointed out that they had the most amazing pronunciation. right? It was just extraordinary. And I think it affected everything about their learning, identity, culture. Just having that access to language was extraordinary.
John, I wonder if more work needs to be done around understanding that intersectionality around English and then learning other languages as well. And just while I've got you, if anyone's unfamiliar, can you give us a sense of what education yarning circles are all about?
Oh, that's tapping into a very ancient process a lot of panellists are aware and connected to. And my community, my country, we call it bowls or circles. There's definitely a pedagogical process around creating a structure and ways. We use it in research. Indigenous Knowledge System Lab at Deakin uses the processes as well. It can operate at multiple layers, and it's an amazing tool to be able to share more about ways of learning rather than about us. So the pedagogical factor is an important piece. And blessed too, I'd like to share that here in the city, diaspora, Logan City, Windaroo State High has got an amazing yarning circles, processes, representation of bowls, as a lot of the schools around the country do, and they link it to their pedagogical frame, so they make sure it's a resource that can be used from the high school in science, in maths, in English. So it's got a multiple layer to it, which is the best way to do as well.
A national emergency. That's how health professionals have described the impact of kidney disease on First Nations people. The illness affects 1 in 10 Australians, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are disproportionately affected, being twice as likely as non-Indigenous Australians to develop kidney disease and 4 times more likely to die with it. In a bid to improve detection and treatment, Kidney Health Australia has announced a new set of guidelines for delivering culturally safe kidney care for First Nations Australians. For more on this, we're joined in Darwin by nephrologist and clinical researcher with the Flinders College of Medicine and Public Health, Professor Jackie Hughes. Welcome to the program.
Hi Dan, and hi to your listeners and the panellists. It's great to be online with you all today.
And thank you so much for jumping out of that conference early that you've been at, that is in fact at the forefront of this very conversation. We're very grateful to have you. Can you give us a sense of how did we get to this point? How is kidney health at such a crisis level?
So Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have always lived with excellent kidney health and excellent health and governance and systems, and we live within a structure that has systematically undermined that. There's been great acknowledgement at the conference this week and has underpinned the guidelines being developed that colonisation is a really important structural determinant to undermine so that we can come back to kidney health. So kidneys are really important for all of our body's health, but we need to operate within a system that really brings back into what community need, want and will thrive with kidney health. So I'm really happy to have played my part in the contributions to the guidelines being written and now launched on Sunday, but there's lots more work to do.
I want to get to some of the guidelines in a moment. Kidney disease is known as the silent illness because it's so hard to detect in early stages. What does that mean in particularly when you're talking about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, some in very remote areas?
So we actually have the clinical systems to detect changes in kidney function. So that's a blood test, an EGFR test, a urine test to check for protein or blood, and to have a blood pressure check. Those are simple things that are readily available internationally and in Australia. The challenge is that when people have a change in kidney function and lose kidney function, that might not have many symptoms at all until very late stage. So it's about bringing healthcare access and screening readily to every healthcare system, and that requires having a big community awareness about the importance of just having your annual health check and creating healthcare models so that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people feel safe, feel respected and succeed within an excellent healthcare system that we do provide for kidney health in Australia.
Yeah, and you mentioned those guidelines that have been in part developed at the conference that you're at right now with a focus around culturally safe kidney care for First Nations Australians. Give us a sense, a bit more of a sense of what went into developing those and what you're hoping they'll achieve.
So guidelines are really important to guide clinical practice. So it's what medical, nursing, allied health clinicians use within that framework. And so if we can write a guideline and we can actually teach people about what's in the guideline and we can create systems to monitor and to evaluate, what we're actually achieving through changing practice and changing practice standards, then we have a way of being able to talk about everyone getting access to best healthcare, and through best healthcare having access to best health outcomes. So the guideline, this is the first guideline for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's kidney health in Australia, and this is work led by Kidney Health Australia initially, and I wanted to give a shout out to Denisha Duff, the inaugural manager of Aboriginal programs at Kidney Health Australia. She hooked me into this business because she identified as a person outside of the kidney health space but coming into that work that we should have a guideline. So it's been a few years in the making, and we didn't go quickly to create a guideline. We intentionally slowed down and made sure that we were in the right place and space to consult with and receive leadership advice from community, because they know what best care looks like, and it was the responsibility of the healthcare system to learn, hear, and to make that work.
Ngaree, just how important to you is culturally safe care?
It's vital, and it's not just important to me, it's actually important to all the accrediting bodies now as well. So APRA, which is our registering body, not just for doctors but for all health professionals, has now ensured that cultural safety is not only part of these standards, but you can report health professionals who are being culturally unsafe. Because a lot of the reason that our communities have mistrust around healthcare systems and around going to a hospital is because there's this fear that it is not safe for them. And so most are turning to the work of Aboriginal community-controlled health organisations, which do a phenomenal job, but also can't be looking after every single First Nations patient because there just aren't enough Aboriginal health services in that regard. So this is something that really has to be looked at, and we need to really acknowledge that still there is these systemic racist systems that mean that our patients aren't getting best practice care, exactly what Professor Hughes was just talking about.
John, if those places of healthcare are not culturally safe and there's not a level of trust from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to go to them, what impact does that have?
Oh, it has the inverse impact. I was going to follow Ngaree there too and shout out institutes of ours like the Institute of Urban Indigenous Health, which have really clear community engagement campaigns, really clear health check flows, and that they are recognised as the safe space. And I think it was a really core tenet too that both Professor and Doctor shared just previous, and that is, what is the other 97% doing? It's such an important piece, this creating more of a safe space with the guidelines that the other 97% spaces do and lean into more. But it really has to be shouted out, our Aboriginal community health services and the great work that they do and the expertise they lead with, because they're the spaces we need to invest in to expand greater and more culturally responsive healthcare.
Nareen, just how key is access to better health messaging around this issue of kidney health?
I find it really interesting. In our family, people talk about kidney trouble, and I'm sure the medical people on the panel understand what that means. Some people have it, some people don't, and they just do. They're just born with it, and I don't. So how rife is that kidney weakness in our communities? Has it become normalised? I worry about a lot of health things with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people having become normalised over the period since colonisation, just as fear of going to the doctor was normalised. All of these things, all of these are factors, and obviously the messaging about safe, non-discriminatory, culturally safe places are the most important things. And I think Jackie talked about picking it up early. I think that's the most important thing. And again, in a whole lot of policy areas, it's becoming evident that there is the light is going on in terms of Indigenous-led policy formulation and implementation and practice, most importantly. But I think the most important thing that can occur in terms of both the practices and the messaging is that it be Indigenous-led.
Yeah, Jackie, you touched on that about being Indigenous-led. Where does that intersect with this question around trust?
So one of the important things that have come out from the guidelines is there must be Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander workforce at every level in renal care, because Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people care for family. That actually came out of the last session that I came from just before here. And so we need to be able to create employment structures that can safely hold Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander workers across all of our multidisciplinary health spaces. Ngaree will know that recently there was a report from the board governing that did a report on racism, bullying and other microaggressions that everyone in the workforce experiences, but more so amongst the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander medical student and medical workforce. So we need to be able to create those structures where we can be safe to lead within mainstream health service as well as the ARCHO sector. And we have a place. It's undeniable our place to do this and to deliver this work. So yeah, culturally safe care is not just the systems and structures, but it's also about making space and providing resources for Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people to lead as well in employment, in policy, in funding, in evaluations, in research. There's no equivocal space now.
Again, I did a project the year before last with Professor Megan Williams, and for people out there wondering, has Nareen surveyed every Aboriginal workforce in the country? Yep, most of them.
You've worked your way through them.
Yeah, worked my way through them. Anywho, so again, we did a survey, a big piece of work among allied Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander allied health workers, and the particular industry cultures in those industries around registration and around all the things that develop in industry cultures were really difficult for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So again, industries need to look at themselves and look at their roles and responsibilities in making workplaces okay for First Nations workers.
Geoffrey, there's also a part of a discussion here around connection to country, about where healthcare services are, about transportation as well. There are so many other spokes to this.
Yeah, there are, but I think tapping to that point and the idea about making it culturally safe, this is a piece about a set of guidelines that have been developed through Aboriginal leadership. Denisha Duff is, and I've had the fortunate pleasure of working with her in the past as well, and Professor Hughes have led this piece of work to produce a set of guidelines. And Professor Hughes said they slowed it down deliberately to ensure it produced a really brilliant piece of guideline work. And isn't that fantastic, right? That's an industry, slowly, I suspect, embracing best practice when it comes to cultural, soundness. And so this is a good piece. This is a good news story, really, as much as it's about a pretty horrific rate of death for a disease that most of us don't think about. And I'm sure I'm like many, don't go to my doctor talking about what's my kidney function. I certainly know my father doesn't. He probably should be. That's the key demographic who must. But how fantastic in this space we now do have a guideline produced by two, if not, I suspect, a bigger team of Aboriginal culturally sound experts.
Jackie?
Geoffrey, thanks so much for that shout out, because you're absolutely right. I got tapped to come and do this today, but there is a huge group of people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, all across the country who work well with our clinician leaders, and we all want to achieve best practice outcomes. And the great thing is we haven't just launched the guidelines. We know that every site that was evaluated and contributed to these, they made local action along the way. So we've had 5 years of work building best practice as we go. There's more work to do, but we can't not go further in all sorts of medical fields without having Aboriginal leadership, consultation, engagement, advising and critique of the healthcare system.
Yeah, and we're so grateful for the work that you're doing and for being able to share it with us today. Jackie, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Professor Jackie Hughes is a nephrologist and clinical researcher with the Flinders College of Medicine and Public Health. Sports and sponsorship arrangements making headlines this week as a number of athletes reportedly raise questions about funding for their codes. Netball Australia has struck a $15 million deal with Gina Reinhardt's mining company, Hancock Prospecting. Some current and former players with the national team, the Diamonds, have raised concerns over the mining giant's history on Indigenous and environmental issues. Captain Liz Watson says the team wants to make sure any issues players might have are addressed, but says the team understands the importance of the sponsorship arrangement.
We're great supporters of Hancock. We want to make this partnership work with them. There's just been further discussions with Netball Australia and them and the players across, when we're going to wear the dress and when that will happen, and I'm confident it is going to resolve really soon. The girls know that this is a really big investment in our sport and it's going to do amazing things for our high performance program. So we appreciate that, and it's just working through those angst like you mentioned and making sure that everyone, whether you're in the diamonds or not, very comfortable.
Meantime, it's been reported today that Australian cricket captain Pat Cummins has concerns about energy company Alinta's sponsorship of Cricket Australia. That sponsorship deal has since ended, but Cummins has denied he was involved in that decision. Nareen, you were on the board of Netball Australia, I think for a year in 2018. Where does it sit about balancing the need for sponsorship, the rights of the players, the broader values of an organisation as well?
I think I'm really proud of those netties. I think it's really interesting that this issue has come from them as a women's sport, and an Indigenous player has raised an issue and her teammates are falling in behind her. My experience of playing netball, I'm just that classic person who played netball as a kid, and probably until my mid-40s, was very honoured to go onto the Netball Australia board. I've been around netball a lot. My observation and experience over many years is that there's quite a lot of racism in netball at every level, including the board. There was certainly, I experienced some racism there. So I think maybe it's just become a tipping point for players, for an Indigenous player to identify it, speak to it, and these amazing women players to back her around sponsorship. And because players make those games, right? We forget about that. We forget about the rights of players. There'd be no netball without the diamonds.
So you experienced racism at the board level and so that you saw it and experienced it across the organisation. How much of that is then part of the culture of Netball Australia?
I think there's work done. There's been work done on it, but it comes from very much a non-Indigenous perspective. And I'll give you an example. And this goes to a whole lot of issues about racism and how it's perceived and how it's been normalised, because none of the analysis of it comes from an Indigenous standpoint or indeed a diverse standpoint. One of my first meetings, they were talking about One Netball, which was their diversity program, and how proud they were of it. And they were talking about that. That was the other thing over here for diverse people. Indigenous players make up so many local everyone on this panel will know about Indigenous netball carnivals. We all know about netties and the role netball plays in community. And so there was then a promotional video made and released about netball, and it was just all these blonde people. Right? So I don't think there's even a recognition that it manifests in every single thing that's done. I had some things said to me by other board members that would knock your socks off, not at a board meeting, after a board meeting. And in that moment, I just thought, not much point. I went back and talked to very high-profile black netball players, and I said, it seems like it was just the same at comp or local, as the same as it is at local comp level, and they said absolutely. Now then there was some exposure of racism in netball, particularly around selection. I think it was the year before last, and there was a lot of discussion about it, and I'm hoping there's some improvement, but I think there needs to be some work done from an Indigenous and diverse standpoint.
Well, I want to add some context for why First Nations people may have some issues with Hancock prospecting. In 1984, founder Lang Hancock made this proposal for dealing with Indigenous people, and a warning: this material is offensive.
The ones that are no good to themselves and can't accept things, the half-caste, and this is where most of the trouble comes, I would dope the water up so that they were sterile and would breed themselves out in the future, and that would solve the problem.
So that was Lang Hancock, who died in 1992, and there's been a discussion today about whether his daughter, Gina Reinhardt, who now runs the company and is behind this sponsorship deal, can be held, Geoffrey, responsible for his comments that we just heard.
Well, you'd hope that she doesn't share that view. And if she doesn't, then she should make that clear. I would suspect, and I'm no branding expert, that perhaps there's a branding exercise in this for Hancock prospecting as well. There's a long legacy that has many dark days, and that's not just for his grandchildren, but for also community. So I suspect there are two steps to this: a clarification that that's not the position of the current company, let alone its major shareholder, and that probably needs to lead to some major cosmetic, if not substantial, changes at the company. Gina Reinhardt has been extraordinarily generous to sport in this country. We all know this. We wouldn't probably have half the Olympic gold medals we do in the pool, but for her. Is it an excuse for racism? Never. Is Netball Australia desperately trying to grapple with this current trend in Australia with the ascendance of female sport, with commercial viability? They've got a $7 million deficit. This was a $15 million deal. Is this the play out of commercial, considerations, culture runs? Absolutely. It's a tough gig. Is there a way out of this? Absolutely. Is it being led by the players? Completely. And Nareen's absolutely right to say that's who should be leading it, and the First Nations person at that. I think the story has a little way to go, and it'll be really interesting to see how Hancock Prospecting deals with it.
And I think it's an important point you make about the volume of money that that company has put into sporting at all different levels. Ngaree, when it comes to that change, where is the onus here? Is it on the sporting team, the players, the company, all of them?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it comes, any sponsorship money you're going to have to think about. You're going to have to think about where that's coming from, how it aligns with the values of yourself as well as your organisation. And sometimes those values don't always align. So, if I take, for example, the medical field and thinking about sponsorship around medications, back in the day, there used to be a lot more sponsorship from pharmaceutical companies. And that meant that there tend to be more, medications that were done by those pharmaceutical brands. But now there's sort of a conversation in the medical community around just making sure that we're just offering the medications and not necessarily talking about branding or pharmaceutical brands on that. So it's also about thinking about what is best for, whoever you're serving. So in this case, the players, but also, in the medical industry, it's the patients. So it really is a conversation that has to be had between the players, the organisation, and then also how those values align.
And John, we are still waiting or trying to find more information about what exactly the pressure point here is between the player and this arrangement. Some of that information hasn't come out yet. The reports say that the team members, though, are backing in this Indigenous player. The pressure, though, is mounting on her. What do you think she would be going through right now?
Oh, it's a unbelievable pressure point to be singled out, folks. I guess for me, that's the shout is the bravery when athletes do that, make that stance. Also move the BS or the dial around sport not being political. We're all political beings. We're a part of a democratic nation. We have our ideas and thoughts, and for the thoughts to be put forward and sung out in the opposition, it really makes the players and the playing group think more about, well, what are we doing? What does this mean? I think that's mirrored then in Cricket Australia, and there's mirrored in a whole range of different. I think about a previous rugby league sponsorships used to be smokes and other type industries, and that's changed. So it's a good pressure point in relation to a bigger conversation. It's really important that we don't get into court, as we often do, into a scapegoating or a singling out piece, because this is more about netball as a collective, and we've heard some great insights already about some of the challenges that netball faces and has faced in relation to Indigenous identity. But more importantly is the other 97%. You know, what does it say about the use of natural resources and extraction in our country? And are there other ways of tapping into other sponsorships that don't do that? It's a good challenge to have, and I'd just like to shout out in relation to the bravery of taking that stance and singing out those political differences.
Completely. Oh no, I was just going to say something perhaps a little cheeky, which, you know,
Really?
for a billionaire daughter of a racist, you've got to feel for her because, you know, she's got a mining company, finally finds a sport, the team's named after a product that comes out of the ground, and she still can't get a break.
It's very important to note these are not her comments, but
it's her father's, I said.
Oh, yeah,
and that's why I'm saying, you know, this is a really great opportunity, and I think Tracy Holmes in her article today for ABC Sport said this. We're still yet to hear from the company, and particularly from Gina Reinhardt, and it's what a great time to reset the relationship for that business with the cultural values, but not only of the sport, of that wonderful athlete, but I probably suspect the country and where we've got to in saying, no, Lang was wrong. And in fact, this company not only supports this team, absolutely backs Aboriginal players, also employees, wants to do culturally sound practices in our business, boom, 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 boom. Like, there's a leadership opportunity for Gina here.
Well, and this is the leadership opportunity we're seeing across sporting fields and teams, isn't it, Nareen? There is change. There are conversations happening. Whether that leads to change is another question.
Well, yes, I think that what's forgotten often is that sport is a workplace. It is bound by legal frameworks. As you know, my life's work is workplaces. Sport is like no other workplace, or every other workplace in my view. The legal frameworks just aren't working. The legal frameworks were devised a long time ago by white men, except for Susan Ryan, bless her memory. And the frameworks and the way they are implemented at workplaces, of which sport is one, with someone having to make a complaint in an environment that isn't victim-centred and doesn't take into account the trauma that people go through those processes. It then is investigated by bodies that are appointed by the employer that aren't independent, and then there has to be that court, that people have to undergo that court process. So it's entirely inadequate. Our understandings of racism as a broad national community are made by not the people who are impacted by racism. We understand that there is such a thing as Indigenous standpoint theory, but there needs to be a broader understanding that everyone's perspectives are different, as they should be, and that those people who are victims of racism across the community, and they're not just Indigenous people, need to be considered in the way these things are dealt with.
We'd like to advise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that the following discussion will include images, voices and names of a deceased person, which we're using with the permission of the family. Today, hundreds of mourners have gathered to farewell beloved actor, author and Aboriginal elder Uncle Jack Charles at a state funeral in Melbourne. The Bunwurrung, Dja-Dja-Wurrung, Woiwurrung and Tangarang man died at the age of 79 last month. At today's service, attendees were encouraged to dress with flair and creativity to pay tribute to Uncle Jack's character and to his approach to life. The service began with a smoking ceremony to clear the way and was followed by loving tribute to the renowned storyteller and community leader.
On you, Jack, I knew you'd get a packed house for your last show, mate.
35 years caught on the treadmill of acting, drugs, burgs, jail time. Many of those years without a roof over his head. And miracle of miracles, how at the age of 60, after making the documentary Bastardy, he somehow managed to jump off that treadmill.
Knowing what a tough life he had, he deserved those last couple of decades or so.
Uncle Jack was a lighthouse of love that never stopped shining. His ability to lift up those around him was unlike anything I've ever seen.
I tried to schedule in rest days in his calendar. He said to me, "Nah, mate, I'll be fine. I'm Aboriginal. I can do anything."
and it was through his example that he inspired hope. There is light at the end of the tunnel. If I can get off, so can you.
I knew he passed that morning because he did hear me. I love you, old mate. I'm gonna miss you.
A very powerful and moving farewell, Ngaree. You and your team worked quite closely with Uncle Jack, particularly around COVID-19. What did he mean to you?
Dan, don't ask me that on a day like today. I think it's not even about me. It's actually about what he's meant to the community more broadly. And I talk about the community, not just the First Nations community, but I think, you know, everyone that lives across these nations that we now call Australia. I mean, I wouldn't even be doing justice to his legacy to try and speak to it. And I think it was spoken to really well today in that service. But he was such an advocate in every space. It wasn't just the arts that he made an impact. He made a huge impact in education. And someone actually spoke about his role as an educator. And one of those roles was working in the health response. So he was actively involved in the COVID response in Victoria, and he was part of this campaign of the T-shirt that I'm wearing. And he was really there advocating for health promotion and talking to communities about understanding what COVID was, you know, how to look after yourselves, how to look after your community. And we've been talking about it since the first segment around education and literacy and how important it is to talk to our communities in a way that is understood and a way that respects our ways of knowing and learning. And he did that. So, you know, I can't even begin to describe what he means to not just me, but to a lot of my family, our communities.
John, you've described Uncle Jack as a tall tree. What do you mean by that?
Just like even the city where I am here in Brisbane, like the iconic gums they grow everywhere in Australia. And we're blessed to have elders weave through our lives. Just heard Sis there explain more about Uncle's passing, and you know, it's that notion of being able to aim for, how to look at, move forward, and to have those guides like Uncle and the legacy there that he leaves, and then also gives the nation around that the legacy of his great work in artistry. It provides another marker to aim towards. Yeah, and that's what I mean when I refer to, or a mob often refer to others as tall trees.
Geoffrey, he held a place in the Australian identity as a storyteller, as playing iconic characters. What did he mean to you?
So I, as someone who loves going to the theatre, had the privilege of seeing him perform live many times, and I just feel like in probably the 20-odd years I've been going to theatre, he played a range of so many characters, but they all shared these elements of being extremely mischievous, deeply the source of truth in whatever production it was, and always a man of a certain age. And I feel like, I just wonder next time I go to the theatre and there's a character of that nature in there, for me, like, who will play it? Because it's always been him, whether it's on screen or on the stage. And what's most interesting about that is he obviously lived a life that was huge, and it was full of character itself. He was massively important in the truth-telling exercises in Victoria. It's a huge gap, and it's a gap that needs to be filled in the truth-telling exercise in the theatre and in the television space, and it leaves a great opportunity for so many people to step into and build on that legacy.
Nareen, you've described him as having a combination of grace and firmness, of being the best of humans.
I think so. I was always struck by his extraordinary grace, and after everything that he'd been through, and he was able to gather the strength to play that public role that he did, as Geoffrey says, with the truth-telling. And I think I'm hopeful that there will be a truth-telling around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander lives over the next little while, and not just about being stolen, but I sometimes think the notion of being stolen and what it must have been for parents to have children stolen is just such an extraordinary one. And as Geoffrey said, Uncle Jack and the way he told it made it real. So his grace in being able to live in this place. My sister tells this story about how he used to drive around, Ngaree, I'm sure you'll tell it too, on his scooter in Carlton and Fitzroy with our flag flying and his hair flying and, you know, waving up to everybody, black and white, that he went past. And that presence I didn't know Uncle Jack. I'd seen him at the theatre and obviously on telly and stuff, but I had a number of exchanges with him on Facebook about our mutual love of men in shorts, which went to AFL players, right? And I just thought, you cheeky old thing. It was hilarious. And there I was, some unknown straight chick on Facebook that he was having this exchange with. He, I think, was the best of humans and showed such an example to this place of a person that had had so much done to him but could ride around Carlton with his hair flying.
Be having a radar and waving up.
Yeah.
Well, he was also renowned for his candour and openness about his life, from being a member of the stolen generation to experiencing homelessness, as well as navigating his own identity. In July of this year, just 2 months before he passed away, Uncle Jack spoke with the ABC about the shock to receive a phone call from the Stolen Generations Advisory Committee. He said he was asked to prove his Aboriginality in order to receive a second instalment under the Stolen Generations Repatriation Scheme.
It just doesn't pass the pub test. There's questioning of me, Jack Charles, my Aboriginality, my indigeneity. It's a foregone conclusion, been proven in so many different ways that I am Aboriginal. My brain isn't wired to tolerate behaviour like this. I'm a simple man. Yeah, you needed a mongrel like myself in order to waggle a finger, point the bone and stamp the foot at this irresponsible behaviour.
Ngaree, what impact did it have hearing Uncle Jack speaking so powerfully and candidly about having his identity questioned?
Yeah, it just goes to the conversations that I've had with my elders in my community about, you know, what it's mean to be constantly defined by other people. I mean, we hear it today, you know, I talk about us as First Nations, but that's also Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, that's also Indigenous. And these are the terms that other people have given us, and they're not the terms that we've decided upon. You know, you'll hear us say, you know, I'm a proud Quandamooka and Yorta Yorta woman because they're my nations, that's my community. And, you know, especially for someone who's done so much in this space and been so generous in sharing his story about the stolen generation and the impact of that, and also to be so well known by community to then be asked about that. I just, you know, it made me quite angry in that way. And actually, you know, it should only ever be for us to define, and that's how it's always been looked at. And even if you know, talk about the definition, it's about you defining yourself, your community also defining you. And that's exactly where it should sit.
Geoffrey, he said that he'd been re-traumatised because of that very questioning of who he was. That is traumatic, isn't it?
I think it is, but I also think the way he dealt with it, that, you know, characteristic humour that doesn't in any way dilute the power of the trauma or the lesson or the strength of it, but also in a way is a coping mechanism, is going to be one of his great legacies. I mean, as we go through the process of a country of heading towards truth-telling, I think a lot of people forget that, yes, I hope and pray we'll have a great and resounding yes in the referendum, but then the next step is this truth-telling process, which will be traumatic for lots and lots of people. And actually there's a little bit of that, you know, the mongrel perhaps, that's going to be required for us to make it a truly transformative exercise. And I think given he was so involved in truth-telling, there's a lot of lessons for us to learn from that. I mean, I got into a taxi yesterday and the taxi driver asked me what I did, and he said, oh, it's great that you help Aboriginal people. I said, oh, I'm also Aboriginal. He said, oh, but you're very fair. And there's just that kind of exacerbated breath of like, oh, for goodness sake.
Again.
Yeah, thanks. Thank goodness it's a short ride tonight. Like, you know, so it's a common thread we all share. And as much as it is trauma, it's sadly a unifying experience from that generation down to, you know, ours.
John, what's the risk when people's identity is questioned or challenged?
Oh, identity politicking is that's a part of the race debate in Australia, and it's something we haven't settled. And colleagues online tonight can attest to that. And it's these structural, we've spoken of as well, institutional racism, it just repeats itself. So the fact that stolen generations, repatriations was a pressure point and a burr point is a great reflection of what's wrong in our systems and our system responses. Native title is another great example. We've got some amazing elders and elders past up in the skies now. Language revitalises songmen and women. And, you know, our native title process in Queensland, it's taken over 20 years. And then what happens, unfortunately, is our elders pass. So the identity politicking is something we have to set. And we've got to be real about too. There's an opportunity, like I heard Brother there talk about truth telling. I mean, that's what the national curriculum provides space for. That's what I was mentioning around the cross-curricular priority, is that there's actually an opportunity to be very clear in our education space from prep to grade 12 that the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories, our shared histories, there's a real truth there to make sure that it is at the front, that First Nations first is a priority. And that would provide a clearer and an even safer way leading into our education institutes, building off that, leaning into that strength. Because another process too will be traumatic if it's not done in the way that I heard Professor share today. That's the thing. There's some great models that we have in our country. We just don't highlight and accentuate those enough. So
I think that what the very unique thing, well, not unique at all, in fact there's a lot of tall trees and elders like it, but what he showed this place was that combination of grace and firmness about who he was and what he'd undergone with his grace and generosity.
And is that one of the enduring messages as we go into having conversations about truth-telling identity as well?
I hope so. I think our inherent and fundamental ways are generosity. I think it's one of the reasons Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, or however, or descendants in my case, choose to label us, get shocked by things like racism because culturally we're just not nasty. But I think there's impacts of racism and impacts of trauma, as John rightly identifies. This identity politicking, to me, plays itself out as racism in a lot of ways.
Well, there are many more conversations to be had about that in a year and more to come. That is all we have time for now. Thank you so much to our deadly panel, Nareen Young, Geoffrey Winters, John Davis and Dr Nareen Blow. Ellen Fanning is back with you tomorrow. Have an excellent evening. Good night.